With its breathtaking views and rich culture, Mexico may seem like a paradise for tourists. But beware, this paradise can be deadly. From people vanishing without a trace to gruesome tales of misfortune, these stories are sure to send chills down your spine. Join us as we uncover 5 chilling accounts of American tourists who went missing, leaving behind a trail of endless questions. Over the years, Patrick's passion for exploring had taken him to many remarkable places. In the summer of 2018, he took his first ever trip outside the Americas, visiting Southeast Asia. But he loved Latin America best. The people, the food, the different cultures tied together by a beautiful language, it all spoke to him. And now he was in Mexico, enjoying a short trip before returning home. How was he to know that he'd meet his untimely and senseless end there? It was October 24, 2018, when Patrick Braxton Andrew left his home in North Carolina and boarded a plane to Mexico. At 34 years old, Patrick was a seasoned traveler. After college, he had spent a couple of years working to earn enough money for an 18-month journey that took him to Mexico and the northern parts of South America. It was then that he found his love for the Spanish language, a subject that he had struggled with throughout his formal education. He learned the language quickly, then went back to his home in Davidson, North Carolina, where he became a part-time Spanish teacher and the owner of a tutoring and mentoring business. And now he was back in Mexico, where he planned to visit the Copper Canyon National Park. Patrick arrived in Urique, a municipality in Mexico's northwestern state of Chihuahua, on either October 26th or October 27th. He checked into a local hotel and set out to explore the area. He only had a couple of days to do so because he was meant to meet his brother in Mexico City on October 30th. Patrick wanted to make the most out of this time. He was excited, despite the fact that the small state of Chihuahua is known to be dangerous due to crime and other drug-related activities. On October 28, 2018, Patrick spoke to his parents at about 2:51 p.m., then left his hotel. He set out on a hike to a spot known as La Playita. The day was beautiful, and so was the country. Everything was perfect. 2 days later in Mexico City, Carrie Braxton Andrew waited for his brother. They were supposed to meet, but Patrick never showed up, and at that point, there had been no communication from him in 2 days. By now, Patrick's family was worried. They contacted the hotel owner and were stunned to find out that Patrick never got back from his hike 2 days before. Patrick's family alerted the authorities. More than 100 Mexican police officers started searching for the 34-year-old man, combing the Copper Canyon region, hoping to find any trace of Patrick. They searched by plane and with the help of drones, but nothing turned up. It was as if the earth had swallowed Patrick up. And then, on November 17th, they found something. A body. Authorities quickly identified it as Patrick Braxton Andrew. His body was discovered about a mile away, leading to the village of Guapalena to Las Lajas, Urique. But how could this be? The area had already been thoroughly searched. It only got more confusing from there. The body had been found on a stony surface in an area with no vegetation. Then how come it was covered in reddish dirt and pine leaves? It only took an educated guess and an autopsy to figure out what had really happened to Patrick Braxton Andrew. He'd been shot in the head, buried somewhere in the mountains, and then dug up and dumped off the road where police eventually found him. But why? As the investigation continued, the governor of Chihuahua declared that Patrick had been assassinated. Moreover, Chihuahua Attorney General Cesar Peniche Esquivel said that sometime during his hike in La Playita, Patrick encountered members of a Sinaloa cartel drug trafficking cell. It is possible that Patrick was mistaken for being a U.S. Drug Enforcement Administration agent and was killed by either notorious drug trafficker Jose Noriel Portillo Gil, known as El Chueco, or by one of his men. Rumors that Patrick was the victim of a drug deal gone wrong were quickly dismissed by Mexican authorities, who described the man as an innocent victim who suffered the misfortune of crossing paths with El Chueco. It was more than unusual for Wilmer to miss breakfast without letting his friend know. Ever since he came back to Mexico, the man made sure to see his friends each and every weekend. Otherwise, his was a lonely life. His wife had died years ago, and he had only his beloved dog, Bones, to keep him company. So where was he? And why didn't he tell anyone if he was leaving? Wilmer, who was originally from Markleyville, a small town in Northern California near Lake Tahoe, was camping on the Mexican peninsula of Baja California. He was no stranger to the place. Wilmer and his wife had driven to Mexico on trips for 20 years. His wife's death in 2019 briefly stopped his visits to the area, but now he was back. Wilmer lived in his camper with his dog, Bones, in a very remote area of Baja California. As long as he could go have breakfast with some nearby friends a couple of times a week, the man could manage the solitude and the quiet. In fact, he liked this peaceful life, which usually went on without incident. Sure, there was that nasty matter a few months before. Wilmer was driving in his camper when he was involved in a traffic accident with two Mexican siblings. The accident sparked a heated confrontation, and Wilmer had to give them 50,000 Mexican pesos, or the then equivalent of $2,723 for damages and injuries to them and the vehicle. After that unpleasant affair, the 80-year-old went on to live on the peninsula. But his not going to breakfast was out of character. His friends were worried. That February 11th, they decided to pay Wilmer Trivett a visit to see if everything was all right with their friend, whom they affectionately called Dino. But once they got there, they were met with a worrisome sight. Bones was all alone sitting on the porch, no sign of Wilmer in sight. Wilmer's friends knew the man never went anywhere without his dog. With a sinking feeling in their guts, they decided to walk down to where they knew Wilmer's motorhome was supposed to be, except that it wasn't there and neither was Wilmer. They alerted the authorities, which in turn let the man's family know about his disappearance. They had no idea where he was either. At first, the search was fruitless. With no evidence and no leads, authorities were at a loss about what to do. But it all changed on February 23rd, when, almost 2 weeks after Wilmer's disappearance, a law enforcement officer found the man's camper. The camper had been burned up, which led authorities to believe there was foul play involved in the case. 2 months later, in April 2023, a trained cadaver dog made a gruesome discovery. Authorities found a decomposing body buried in a shallow grave. It belonged to Wilmer Trivett, but who could have done this? And why? It didn't take long for authorities to circle back to the traffic dispute Wilmer had been involved in some months before. As it turned out, their guess was correct. After the car accident, the two Mexican siblings and Wilmer Trivett got into a heated argument. Wilmer paid them and figured the matter was done. But months later, the pair figured the payment wasn't enough. Still enraged, they kidnapped the 80-year-old man and took his life. Juan Hectorin and his sister Jocelyn Guadalupean, whose full names have not been released in accordance with Mexican law, then buried the body in a shallow grave, burned the man's camper, and left, their anger now quenched. Wilmer is lovingly remembered by his friends and family and by his beloved dog, Bones. Harry Devitt was a true adventurer. He had enough of it for 10 people. He had seen much of the world over the years, and he understood that it could be as dangerous as it was extraordinary. The chipped tooth he got from a gun shoved in his mouth in Venezuela was testimony to this, but nothing quite compared to what he was living now, in Mexico. The military had just escorted him out of a very dangerous area, and he was told another escort was waiting for him in another town. Just as well, as long as he could still make it to Brazil, to the World Cup. He sent his girlfriend a quick text explaining the situation, and then resumed his journey, his motorcycle engine roaring. Harry Devitt had no idea what awful fate awaited him. It was January 25, 2014, when Harry Devitt sent his last ever text. At 32 years old, Harry was an adventurer through and through, but nothing could have prepared him for the tense situation in Mexico. The New Yorker had just recently traded in a high-flying finance career for the freedom of a transcontinental motorcycle journey. He'd wanted to have one last epic adventure before finally settling down, planning to motorcycle through Mexico and Central America to Brazil in time for the World Cup, and then make his way to Ushuaia, the world's southernmost city. Harry's journey had brought him to Michoacan in Mexico, where the situation seemed out of control. After a gang of civilians had taken action against a key drug cartel the previous month, the Mexican government sent thousands of troops and police to keep the peace. The government then joined forces with the vigilantes in order to overthrow the cartel. The situation was getting tenser and more dangerous by the day, and Michoacan was now the worst possible place for a tourist. 4 days later, on January 29, 2014, Harry's mother, Anne Devitt, was waiting for her son to call. January 29th was Harry's late father's birthday, and the 32-year-old always, without fail, called his mother on this occasion. When he failed to do this, and given the fact that the last anyone had heard from Harry was 4 days before, Anne got the sinking feeling that something was terribly wrong with her son. That's when she alerted Mexican authorities. She traveled to Mexico, relentlessly seeking answers. For months, Harry's friends and family sifted through tips, reported sightings, and false leads. They spread the word on Facebook pages dedicated to the young adventurer. They never lost hope for a happy outcome. Then July came around and everything changed. 300 miles from Harry Devert's last known location, Mexican authorities found a motorcycle buried in a shallow grave. The motorcycle was stripped for parts and muddy, but the identification number was still intact. The motorcycle wasn't the only thing in the grave. There were also 2 bags, each containing the badly decomposed remains of a man. Anne Devert gave a DNA sample to the police to help confirm the identity of the remains, and the results were clear. The remains belonged to her son, Harry Devert. Authorities now believe Harry Devert was mistakenly taken for a U.S. drug enforcement agent and killed by Adrian Reyes Cadena, a local gang leader. Cadena, known as El Tigre, was arrested in August 2015. Anne Devert believes her son was simply in the wrong place at the wrong time, an innocent victim to the whims of dangerous and cruel people. The plan was simple. Now that the weather cleared up, they could start their adventure and sail their 41-foot sailing vessel from Mexico to San Diego. Sure, it wasn't going to be an easy trip, but all 3 of them were experienced sailors and were confident they could conquer even the tallest waves and the most unforgiving winds. Hopefully, this wouldn't be the case. They were in for an early departure. At that point, there was nothing that would have alerted them about what was to come out there, far from the safety of the shore. It was April 4th, 2023, when Frank O'Brien, his wife Carrie O'Brien, and their friend William Gross set sail from Mazatlan, Mexico. They were beginning their journey to San Diego, California, but first, they needed to stop in Cabo San Lucas and stock up on supplies. The 3 of them spent the morning of April 4th making calls about the upcoming stop, stating they would arrive 2 days later on April 6th. Frank and Carrie were both licensed boat captains. The couple had hired William Gross to help on their planned 11-day trip. The journey was ambitious but manageable, especially with Gross on board, a man who was said to be able to fix anything and who had over 50 years of experience as a sailor. The 3 of them combined had almost 100 years of experience. The O'Briens and Gross also had a lot of faith in their boat, which was appropriately called Ocean Bound. Ocean Bound was a 41-foot sailboat, manufactured about 35 years before in Taiwan. Despite its age, the sailboat was trusty. It was crafted from solid fiberglass. It was time-tested. It was no stranger to the whims, the beauty, and the perils of ocean waters. William texted his daughter on that April 4th, letting her know they were setting sail at about 9:30 a.m. 2 days later, several people in Cabo San Lucas waited for Frank, Carrie, and William to make their stop and grab their supplies, as previously discussed. But the hours passed, and there was still no sign of the Ocean Bound. They didn't show up the following day, nor the day after that. Back home in the U.S., Mike Argall, Carrie's brother, was getting worried, and so was Melissa Spicuza, Willima's daughter. It was so unlike them not to call or text. What if something had happened to them out there, on the ocean? It was time to take action. They alerted the authorities, who immediately started searching for the missing boat. There was no record of them ever making it to Cabo San Lucas, which added to the ominous feeling of the whole thing. To make matters worse, authorities knew that Ocean Bound lacked GPS tracking, and with communication in the area around Baja being notoriously spotty, the search had to be done the old way. The Mexican Navy and U.S. Coast Guard launched a massive search, combing through 200,057 square nautical miles off Mexico's northern Pacific coast, an area larger than the entire state of California. Canada also provided additional assets. They used helicopters, boats, and every piece of technology at their disposal, but there was no sign of the missing vessel, no trace of the 3 Americans. After spending 281 cumulative hours trying to at least get a lead, the Coast Guard eventually had to make a difficult call. They suspended the search. "Unfortunately, we found no evidence of the 3 Americans' whereabouts or what might have happened," said Commander Gregory Higgins. Authorities believe it is possible the 3 had encountered bad weather conditions and 20-foot waves. but what happened to the three Americans is still a mystery. The weather was worsening. Conditions were adverse, with an extreme reverse tide. Kayaking no longer seemed like a good idea, especially for a 14-year-old girl. Corey decided it was time for his daughter to return to their rented home, but he couldn't let her go alone. No, he was going to ensure the girl's safety first, and then return for Yeon-soo, his wife. He trusted that everything was going to be all right, but he had no way of knowing for sure. It was November 24th, 2022. Corey Allen, his wife, Yeon-soo Kim, and their 14-year-old daughter were on vacation. They left their home in Flagstaff, Arizona, and were now staying in a rented house in Puerto Penasco, Mexico. Puerto Penasco, also known as Rocky Point in English, is a small city located 62 miles from the border with Arizona. Tourism and fishing are the main activities of the city. Tourists from all over come for its beaches and its pleasant resorts. There are also many available activities for those tourists who'd rather do something else than sunbathing. On that Thursday, Corey, Yeon-soo, and their daughter decided to go kayaking. It was meant to be a family outing, a chance to paddle along the peaceful waters off Playa Encanto. But the weather had other plans. The wind picked up that Thanksgiving afternoon, strong enough to whip the waves into a frenzy. Suddenly, maneuvering a kayak no longer seemed like an easy job. This wasn't the kind of weather amateurs can face. As the wind turned fierce, the tide turned with a force that made the shoreline recede. That's when Corey realized they were in danger. This wasn't the place for a teenager. He decided to take his daughter out of the water and back to their rented home. After leaving his 14-year-old where he knew she was safe, Corey returned to the beach for his wife, Yeon-soo Kim. They'd be back soon, and then they'd all be together again. But as the day grew longer, the couple's daughter became more and more concerned. Her parents had failed to return as promised. She raised the alarm later that afternoon, and a full-scale search began. Volunteers scoured the land, sea, and air for the missing couple. In the meantime, family members flew to Mexico to take care of the daughter. By Sunday, hope to find them alive somewhere was beginning to wane. That afternoon, a local fishing boat found a body some 8 miles off the coast near Mayan Palace. The Civil Protection and firefighters of Puerto Penasco released a statement saying that the features matched one of the missing persons. A member of the Allen family confirmed the heartbreaking news. It was Yeon-soo Kim. The search for Corey continued, but it was as if Corey had vanished into thin air. After a few days, the family called off the search. Corey's kayak was found southeast of Puerto Penasco, but there was no sign of the man.